Hey folks, thanks for watching. It is Tuesday, November 11th. A few housekeeping things. One, I'm actually in Florida here this morning in a hotel, and if the sliders and like the images I'm showing load a little bit slower, the internet's not fantastic. I tried to preload as many of them as I could before this, but sometimes they reset like halfway through the video, so I apologize for that. The other thing is it's kind of nice here. I'm about 7 a.m. Eastern time here. You usually record this about 6 a.m. Central, which is about what it is now. And there's actually like light coming in my window, so my muscle memory and my habit is showing you the infrared satellite imagery across the continental U.S. in the morning because we haven't had sunrise yet, and it's nice to have some like light when you wake up in the morning with the time change as well. That's helping me out a little bit. But the reason I bring that up is because I'm still looking at that infrared imagery here to start. That's my muscle memory when I get up in the morning to at least see what's going on in some fashion. And it's immediately noticeable across the southeast, the temperature contrast. That's what you're looking at, the sensible heat on these infrared satellite images between the Gulf Coast landmass and those warm sea surface temperatures. The Gulf or the Western Atlantic. We were talking about those warm sea surface temperatures with relation to the recent hurricane season, which is winding down, thankfully. But usually the color difference or the contrast between the landmass here and those sea surface temperatures isn't too significant. If you're like 70 to 80 degrees on the landmass and you're like mid 80s in those ocean temperatures or low 80s, the color is going to be very close in the color bar. You can see how different. I mean, this is like pasty white versus like near jet black, and what that's telling you is that these temperatures over the ocean are in the 70s and 80s, and the temperatures here over the landmass are down to like the 30s, if not the 20s, in some areas along the Gulf Coast. So this is a significant cold snap that we're witnessing here this morning. We've been talking about it for at least a week at this point. Widespread freeze warnings are out across a large area. It was very windy last night in Florida. She had red flag warnings posted. I'll show those, some down here, still valid in southern Florida, over in Texas as well. Those winds have died down a little bit here this morning, thankfully, but man, look at all those indigo freeze warnings all the way up into like the Delmarva Peninsula, stretching all the way over into East Texas, all along the Gulf and Atlantic coastline, down into like halfway down the coast of Florida here, even getting down to like the Tampa line, where we're about 38 here this morning. I'm going to zoom in on some of those temperatures quickly here. You're down into 21 up in northern Alabama, 26 hard freeze territory, anywhere from like Atlanta to Starkville to Jackson. Not terribly far from Pensacola, like north, still in West Florida. I found a temperature observation here this morning at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. This would be a significant cold snap any time of the year, let alone in November. And there's certainly some sensitive crops kind of in this corridor here in November, before some of the perennial crops have had time to adjust to winter yet or vernalize. So this is a memorable cold snap for much of the country, and it continues for the eastern and central Corn Belt as well. I mean, you're down into the mid to low 20s in mid to early November. It's just an impressive shot of cold air early on in the season. Thought it was kind of funny. I was watching the local news last night here in Florida, and they're talking about the falling iguanas, because when it gets cold here, the cold-blooded reptiles, I guess, go dormant, so to speak, and fall out of the trees. They don't get too injured when this happens, and they kind of like thaw out and warm up and go on with their day during the sun comes out. But thought it was funny. This is like the talk of the town right now where I'm at, so hopefully I don't get hit by any falling iguanas today when I'm out and about. We saw some snowflakes and snow flurries last night through the some of the areas in the southeast, like North Carolina, South Carolina, otherwise snow showers. Let's see if we can pull up the latest snowfall here from this morning. I know that's small on this map here. I'm going to struggle to make it any bigger. But Eric talked yesterday about that lake effect snow. Ended up being kind of a lighter event in the Chicago kind of proper downtown area, but extremely high snowfall amounts in northern Indiana, southwest Michigan. Even had some decent snowfall down into central Indiana and eastern Illinois. You can see the plains as well over the weekend, getting some of that snow, and some light snow showers and flakes getting all the way down into the Appalachians, even portions of like North Carolina and South Carolina recording some flurries yesterday from what I saw. As the sun set yesterday, I kind of pull up this product from time to time. Let's see if we can play this. If you look closely, you can actually see that snowfall in that lighter blue color before the sunset yesterday evening underneath these kind of swirling low clouds here. It's kind of neat to pick out that recent snowpack. So you don't even need again, this common theme you'll hear with me, you don't necessarily need the analysis. Just go look at what we can see with observations, confirm with our own eyes what the computers and the models are trying to tell us here. But as I play this forward, you can see that flow coming out of the north into the south, ushering that cold air overnight down into the southeast, where, again, just pulling up temperature observations here this morning, 19 here and near Tuscaloosa, very impressive cool temperatures, 22 in northern Alabama. You can even find like 22 up here in the Appalachians, 19 in western Virginia. Just very impressive. 19 here in southern Tennessee. Cold air mass with, I'm finding freezing lines getting close to getting down toward like Disneyland at this point, or Disney World, I should say. And seeing those colder temperatures all the way toward the Gulf Coast. Despite cooler temperatures, at least looking at radar this morning, relatively quiet. Some of these snow showers that you can see here aren't actually making it all the way to the ground in Illinois. Some observations showing just light snow showers here in Wisconsin, but otherwise some of this I think is evaporating, and the drier air on the back side of this low that's come through. That's not the same here for some of these lake effect snow showers we're seeing come through New York, Erie, Pennsylvania. If I jump back and show you those all hazards here valid as of this morning, first off, we'll just go west-east. Winter storm watch is now out. Eric talked about this yesterday, the snow that's coming late this week for the Sierra Nevadas, the moisture that California will need as they have had a decent start to their water year this winter, going into what could be a concerning seasonal forecast, at least for winter in California. I'm going to talk about that at the end of this video, but nice to see them picking up some moisture here in the early part in October and November. But the winter weather advisories are active on the coast of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, including lake effect snow warnings here for Erie, Pennsylvania, areas just to the south, and counties in far western New York as well. Big picture, I'm going to jump over and look at the jet stream here. This is looking kind of more like the western side of North America here. I'm showing that one because we can see that trough exiting out of our area that ushered in that cooler air. We're seeing those snow showers trying to wrap around on the back side, but typically the back side of these systems are drier, so that's why a lot of that is evaporating before it gets to the ground. And then over to the west, this is our next system. So I mentioned that winter storm watch for California. There's our next trough that we need to talk about. It's going to be commingling, for lack of a better word, with this cutoff trough east of Hawaii. And these two together are really going to be our next weather maker, not only for the western U.S., but I think the southeast, giving us precipitation chances in the 7-day forecast that we'll have to talk about. If I make this forecast valid as the recording of this video, it lines up nicely. There's that deep trough that we looked at. There's this next trough coming toward California, this cutoff west here. I'm going to play this forward through early this week. Now we're getting into Wednesday. This trough continuing to exit off to the east, the Canadian Maritimes, and then here comes this next system. Combining with that cutoff low east of Hawaii, it tracks toward the state of California by Thursday, where it makes landfall, so to speak. Coming more so onshore Friday. This is when the strongest precipitation is expected, when the trough kind of coming near like Oxnard or Santa Maria, at least the center of it. And there's some slight differences here with the ECMWF. We'll look at these in a minute. The GFS has been a little bit, I guess I'll call it more like meridional or north to south, keeping this cutoff low a little bit further south than the ECMWF. It's kind of been bouncing back run to run. They're not in wide disagreement right now, but just a few differences. But look at how slow that this cutoff low is now moving. I mean, from Friday all the way through the weekend, it's only jumped over into the Four Corners region. There's this other piece coming in behind it now early next week on Monday that's going to be focusing on Southern California. And by, almost a week from now, November 17th, we have this weak low just kind of tracking through the southeast here, have another low here over Montana early next week. And this is going to be our precipitation maker moving through the southeast early next week, still in that 7-day forecast. We'll have to keep an eye on this cutoff here further to the south. Now, I'm going to jump over. I'm going to get that ECMWF run in comparison. This is from Tropical Tidbits, which we invite you to go there as well. Excellent weather model site. If I play this forecast forward Wednesday, this is now the ECMWF in comparison to the GFS. Pretty similar. There's that cutoff low. This is now Friday. I'm playing this forward again. Look at how slow it's tracking. Now from Friday to Sunday, it's only jumped from like California to Arizona, bringing precipitation to Arizona in the southwest. We mentioned the wildfire activity there. And then that one was a little bit further to the north on Monday to Tuesday. Maybe that precipitation track getting more so into the Corn Belt here. So again, I mentioned the GFS has been a little bit more north to south. What I mean by that is tracking that low, maybe just a little bit more south than this one, which will affect the precipitation swath early next week. We're talking like Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday as that tracks through. But additional troughing setting up over the west in the long range. We're getting out to like the 10-day forecast at this point, getting that nice southwest flow across the central part of the country. This is the ECMWF forecast. If we jump back over to the GFS, take it out to late next week. Again, a little bit more amplified, less coherent than the ECMWF, but we still have that southwest flow and better precipitation chances moving through the central part of the country next week. Now, also, I missed as I kind of walked through this, haven't talked much about the Pacific Northwest. Next week, they're in better line, at least here from this GFS forecast. But if I also jump back and show you the ECMWF forecast, early next week, system moving through on Monday, and then late Thursday, Friday, both from the GFS and the ECMWF, bringing the Pacific Northwest back in line for some precipitation late next week. So if I kind of put this all together in the GFS precipitation forecast itself, rather than just kind of trying to surmise it on the 500 millibar height anomalies, taking this forecast to Thursday, the 13th, system comes onshore, Northern California. This is Thursday morning. Precipitation up into the Pacific Northwest, but lighter, now moving through Central California Thursday evening. Snow begins Thursday night into Friday morning for the Sierra Nevadas. High snow levels, but still expecting quite a bit of snowfall, especially for the southern higher Sierras. And then now moving into Southern California through Friday evening. Cutoff low slowly making its way on Saturday morning into Arizona. Additional showers for the Pacific Northwest, but lighter. And then again, all the way out till Sunday evening, now still just spinning over Arizona. Now it's at this point that that low tracks out into the central part of the country with the southern plains forecast to get some rainfall. And again, the GFS tracking this a little bit further south than the European model as it works through the Tennessee and southeast, Tennessee Valley in the southeast there. There's that cutoff low from the GFS, again, very far south with that next cutoff, bringing rainfall into Southern California and Arizona again. Remember, I said late next week, all the way Friday, and now to Saturday, all the way out to the 21st, 22nd. Details on this aren't clear, but much better precipitation signal here. One, for the Pacific Northwest, and then generally with troughing, either that cutoff from the GFS or more proper long wave troughing from the ECMWF, better precipitation chances starting up late next week, if not next weekend, across the central part of the country in the Corn Belt. You can see that from the ECMWF as well. If I play this forecast forward, I'm going to do this quickly. Here's our late week system here. Cutoff low, slowly moving through the Four Corners region. We also have a low, I do want to mention this one, moving through this weekend out of Canada into the northeast. Some inclement weather there quickly. And then the ECMWF moving this low early next week a little bit further north with respect to that precipitation. Not significant, flooding rains, but still a decent amount. And then as we get further out into next week with that proper long wave trough that I mentioned on the ECMWF versus the GFS, much better rainfall organization here, more proper low pressure system here over Tulsa, Oklahoma late next week. And then also seeing that Pacific Northwest rainfall late next week as well from the ECMWF. So there are some differences. This is an impressive 980 low now. Again, way too far out to put the Sharpie on this or mention the severe weather threat, but there is that potential for much better precipitation, maybe some showers, thunderstorms, and severe weather late next week as this troughing settles into the southwest and we get that southwest flow. We can see this a few different ways. If we jump over and look at the GFS, just their 5 to 7 day forecast, there's that initial system that comes into the west. Pacific Northwest kind of missing out on the better rains initially in the forecast. I mentioned that they're going to get rain. These color bars kind of throw us off in November because, one, the eastern part of the country isn't getting as much rain anyway. So kind of when it looks dry, it's not quite as dry as it looks, and when it looks wet, it's not quite as wet as it looks in the eastern U.S., but it's kind of the opposite for the west. So the Pacific Northwest is typically very wet this time of year, so even though there's rain in the forecast, it actually looks drier, but they still will be wet, I think, through the 7 day forecast. If I take this to 4 to 10 days from the GFS, you can start to see that low sneaking through. We're not quite capturing next weekend's pickup in precipitation yet. If you take it all the way out to 10 days, you're not going to quite see that or the Pacific Northwest rain. But just for example, I'm showing the ECMWF AIFS because we don't have that ECMWF proper in yet, but we do have the AIFS. Take it 4 to 10 days, you're not going to see much. But we go into 8 to 14 days, that's when the Pacific Northwest starts to look a little bit wetter, and then the Central US starts looking much wetter from the AIFS, just for example. If we look at the WPC forecast for the 7 days, again, despite that quote-unquote drier contour, still wet across the Pacific Northwest, wet across California with a lot of this coming as snowfall in the Sierra Nevadas, wet through Arkansas, the southern plains with that better precipitation signal. I don't know if we'll get all the way up to 2 inches here, but certainly by Tuesday to Wednesday of next week, a decent chance at an inch or more for a wide swath here across the southern plains into the mid-south. We'll see about this cutoff line into the central Corn Belt here. I think there's some question mark. I think we might end up with some sort of drier stretch between that sort of clipper system that I talked about and then that system moving more so to the south. The ECMWF bringing that a little bit further north, so WPC may be hedging the bets in between right now, but there's a question mark zone, I think, in the central Corn Belt early next week. Where there's not a huge question mark right now is on the snowfall forecast. While there's quite a bit moving through eastern Canada and the northeast with that system we talked about, and then quite a bit here in the Cascades through the 10-day forecast. I'm going to pull this back. Let's start with 7 days. There's the Sierra Nevadas, getting some Four Corners, Colorado Rocky, snowfall here, the lake effect snow that we mentioned, that Clipper system next week. Canada, as I take the forecast later, though, remember the Pacific Northwest getting better flow late next week. You can start to see the precipitation pick up there in the Cascades and the Northwest as a result, but not seeing a lot across the continental U.S. all the way through the forecast here from the GFS, just not getting a decent enough surge of cold air. Now, the corollary to that is that the warmth in the east is helping to produce that southwest flow. So that trough coming around, settling in from the GFS and the ECMWF. Again, the details aren't clear on this, but high likelihood that we have some sort of flow like this, bringing warm air to the east, but also that moisture source, which is the reason it will be very wet in this quarter here from the 18th to the 24th. And that's the forecast right now from the CPC. Eric mentioned the MJO yesterday. I'm in very, very strong agreement with him. I would be very surprised if we saw a big transition with the MJO from phase 6, 7, all the way through 8 into 1 right now. That we've mentioned in the literature that almost half of these events do not make it from 6 to 7 to 8 because of the kind of pressure to get past the maritime continent here. We can see that on the various Hobmuller diagrams. So I'm going to jump over, and again, I know these are crazy here, but really what we're looking at is easterly wind anomalies versus westerly wind anomalies. This black line is the present time. I didn't draw that straight, but here's November 11th where I'm recording this video. And what we're looking at here is we want to see where the surface winds are converging. So easterly wind anomalies butting up against westerly wind anomalies. We have convergence in the middle of that and better favorability for tropical thunderstorms and MJO activity. And so we can see that through the last, let's call it 2 weeks here, the MJO has been moving very predictably at a very classic speed from phase 4 to phase 5 to phase 6. If we look over at our phase diagram, we're going to see there phase 4, phase 5, and phase 6. So it's moving at a very typical speed. You might surmise, it's probably going to keep going right through phase 6, 7, 8, 9, play along nicely. But if we look at these easterly wind anomalies, we can actually track this convergence zone through the past, and we can see that movement. And if it was going to continue, we'd probably see that convergence continue to track through the Pacific, but we don't quite see it. Maybe initially you could try to draw some convergence in through here with this easterly wind anomaly, but there's also some over here. It kind of pulls it back a little bit. There's a bigger surge well out into the forecast late next week, and that kind of keeps the convergence more so over here, over phase 6, maybe phase 7. And so I'm just not seeing this clear and obvious surge across the Pacific, which is normal in a La Nina year, where it resists this quick movement of the MJO. Now, another way we can look at this, rather than looking at the 850 millibar, we jump over and look at the velocity potential further up to see where there's support for ascent, rising motion, storms, convection, MJO activity, so to speak. And those green colors, again, moving very predictably, phase 3, 4, 5, into 6 here over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Well, we don't see that activity continue. If I keep drawing that straight line, and forgive me, I'm on like a mouse pad right now. I don't have my mouse with me. And we just don't see that activity predictably in the forecast. It sticks over here in phase 5 or even phase 6. I don't even see huge support for phase 7 at this point. So that brings up some question marks, I think, for the late November forecast. We're expecting this variable polar jet stream. Eric talked about this yesterday. Now, as it relates to the temperature conversation, first off, as we get out into next week and that better support for precipitation, we already talked about the warmth that's likely coming for the eastern U.S., a relief from the cool temperatures we're dealing with now. That's going to start as soon as this weekend, actually for a lot of these areas, but persist even late into next week. But as we get further out into the forecast, we still see, let me just do the ECMWF, let's do the GFS ensemble since that latest one is in here. We still see, from the 21st through the 26th, cooler air over the west, cooler air over the Canadian prairie. Eric talked about that yesterday as well, and warmer in the east. And what I think we might be waiting for here is a pattern shift where we reestablish the ridging over the western U.S. and we get that more predictable December pattern that we've talked about. Eric talked about the high confidence in that pattern yesterday. But we're not seeing it yet in the long-range models. And so that introduces some uncertainty here, I think, in my forecast process going into late November. The kind of model support from phase 6 of the MJO in late November would start to suggest we're going to bring ridging back to the western U.S., potentially drier conditions, especially for California, hence our concern for this seasonal moisture forecast for this winter. I mentioned that the La Nina tends to resist that MJO movement across the Pacific. It's for that same reason that we tend to get concerned about California in winter for precipitation chances, because those big transitions from 6, 7, 8 into 1 tend to help usher those atmospheric rivers all the way over into the west coast, bring better flow in that direction. But just not really seeing that yet from the forecast here, the shift over toward ridging in the west. Now, interestingly enough, if we jump over and look at the Climate Prediction Center, their week 3 to 4 outlook, Eric mentioned this yesterday, but I'm going to kind of bring it up in a different light. He mentioned some question marks on the western U.S. warmth for the same reasons I just talked through here, because we're waiting to see if that ridge is going to develop, which has model support in December and has historical analog support with MJO phase 5 and 6. Now, if you actually look, I talked about this last Thursday, I think, you can go look at click on the week 3 to 4 outlook. And if you really wanted to get into the weeds, they produce a discussion, just like I mentioned, the snowfall forecast discussion. So you can click that week 3 to 4 and read through everything they're talking about here. And they actually mention what I'm talking about here. I'm just going to quickly, we're not going to read the whole thing in the video here. But they mention the potential pattern change. I think they actually use the term shift. Yeah, here, it's right here. So we'll zoom this in. They struggled to put the temperature map together specifically because they said the outlook for attempts to unify a 2-week period that is likely to experience a substantive pattern shift with large swings in temperature. And so what I think we're seeing here is they're trying to capture, and this is always the struggle with any forecast you put together, let alone one that has to span 2 weeks, right? November 22nd all the way to December 5th, that they're expecting this forecast to start cold in the west. We've looked at that in the long-range models, that probably November 22nd through the 26th is going to be cold in the west. And then how do you capture if that shifts over very quickly warm? Well, you can't. You just kind of go with the slightly below normal contour because you have to put out a 2-week forecast. So just because this forecast is quote-unquote cold for California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, does not mean we're going to be cold on December 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th, or even the whole winter. And so you don't always get the full story with these forecasts, and they tell you right there in the discussion. So I always invite you to read those if you want to dive into the weeds. So we're still waiting on that ridging out west. If we look in the ECMWF extended model right here, December 1st through the 8th, we see that support for the ridging in the ECMWF extended model. We see it in the seasonal model, and we're just kind of watching and waiting. This would be the positive TNH pattern that we talked about going even back to like October, that tropical northern hemisphere connection, which this winter has support for, where if we start December in this pattern, I think that the kind of all bets are off narrative that Eric said yesterday, where we could have a gangbusters winter for a lot of the East Coast or Central U.S., is going to be in full force. The uncertainty right now is we're in the fog of war. If I look at the long-range forecast, right, we just looked at those panels. Where did I have that pulled up here? We're not seeing that support yet, maybe from the ECMWF AAFS, which we know gets pretty crazy in the long range anyway. And because I'm talking about it, what the heck, let's bring it up. Let's look a little bit closer. And sure enough, if we look at the 500 millibar height forecast from the ECMWF AAFS, there's that ridge, much warmer in the western U.S., much cooler in the east. This takes us Monday, November 24th. We are very far out in the forecast, well past 10 days at this point. This isn't, a firm forecast by any means, but it does show us one signal that, maybe that pattern shift is on the way, the one mentioned in the week 3 to 4 outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. This would actually be an earlier shift than they suggest. And again, this is fleeting right now until it comes into better view, but that's the nature of this long-range weather forecasting, trying to marry what we know and are expecting in the seasonal with what we can see in the short term. Until those link up, you're not going to hear this meteorologist give too confident of a forecast right now. The NMME for December, the latest one that's out here at the beginning of November, kind of curiously stays a bit warmer. This is the 1 month lead, and it's really small right now. Let's try to get that a little bigger. Stays warmer for much of the eastern U.S., eastern Canada, cooler for the Canadian Prairie. This is kind of in line with the what I'll call the kind of 5 to 15 day forecast right now, with some warmth coming back to the southwest. This would actually be, I think, pretty decent for the northwest in terms of precipitation, and decent for the Midwest as well if we can retain that moisture and heat source out of the southeast. I'll jump over and show you their precipitation forecast. See, they're actually drier for California, only a little bit here, but wetter for the northwest, wetter for the Midwest. And again, average to above average precipitation in this quarter here in December is a lot of rain. I mean, this is kind of a time period where they get a decent amount of their rainfall, and decent support here over the Midwest as well. Drier for the Southeast. We've talked about that quite a bit here as we've gone through autumn. Our concern for the Southeast drought that could expand here. The ECMWF seasonal for December is just a little bit different. It has more of that cold air getting all the way in to the Midwest, a little bit drier as a result of that. Some of the heat more so anchored out of the Southwest or Northeast Canada here. And kind of watching and seeing those differences here. Another thing we're keeping an eye on in the long range, we talked about this last week, is this stratospheric warming event. It's kind of early in the season to be watching these, but forecast very quickly shows an impressive stratospheric warming. This from the GFS here. And we can see this if we look at the polar vortex at 10 millibars, way up over the North Pole here. Back this forecast up. Let's play this out. We're watching the polar vortex here, and what we want to see is kind of, if it's a strong polar vortex, it's going to contain a lot of that cold air. It's going to look like a nice, perfect ring here, and you can see already here this morning, it's a little bit elongated, toward North America, maybe playing some role in the Southeast. Now, early November, I don't know how too much influence we can give to the polar vortex, but as I do play this through late November, you'll notice that we start to shift it over Siberia and Scandinavia, start to move in much higher heights here. So we're starting to shun or push the kind of polar vortex out of its traditional position. We're starting to stretch it out across the Arctic here. When this happens, we can get some more inclement weather, more winter-like cold air outbreaks, either in Europe or even all the way over into the southeast U.S. again. This would be way late winter, way out until like November 27th at this point. And what we typically would want to see in the forecast to start to put together that forecast is what we call this cross-polar flow. What I mean by that is usually the air is going to flow around the poles like this, which tends to moderate the cold air, keeps it up here. But if you can flow from literally like from Siberia across the North Pole into the U.S., you're going to get some very cold air because that trajectory is permanent night, and that air is going to get very cold. And just for example, let's look over at the surface pressure anomalies. And if you go back, you can start to see that. If you kind of follow these high pressures, you can see some of these contours here. Notice some pressure following some of these contours all the way back up into the North Pole region. So that gives you your kind of source region for much cooler air to spill into the lower US. We jump over and look at temperature anomalies, and sure enough, late November, much cooler for the Southeast. Again, that's not a firm forecast right now, but does showcase the scenario from the GFS where that stratospheric warming could result in some cold air outbreaks later this month. We're already dealing with one now in early November. I think that's my last slide here. A lot to watch, and late November, definitely a big pivot point. I think a pattern shift is on its way. There's that, just kind of curiously looking at the operational GFS, there's the warm West Coast, cooler East pattern shift that we're kind of watching and waiting for. We'll see where it goes. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow. Thanks for watching.